Now it's working. Okay. So hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for being here, having breakfast with us. So this is a very important event. I know that it might sound like it is not because we don't have a lot of morning people here, but this is a very important event because we are going to talk about climate change and biodiversity, and the nexus between these two topics, and why we really need to consider these two topics together. We just came back from COP16, which was recently. We are not really going to talk in detail about what happened in COP16, but we are now here in COP29, and this year we also have the certification COP. So here we are to talk about all of these details from different perspectives with different stakeholders on how and why we need to connect these two topics more and create more connections. So let me introduce you to all our speakers because we have a little bit of everything. So here we have Alicia Montalvo, who comes from CAF. Then we have Carissa, let me pause for a second, Kasperzak, thank you. Then we have Sandeep Sengupta, Elena Pita, and Frederick Bond. Among all of them, we have a development bank, we have a foundation, we have science, IUCN, we have conservation. So I think that I'm going to stop talking and I'm just going to give them the floor. And we are going to start with Sandeep Sengupta from IUCN. And Sandeep, we were talking before starting about that you were here through all this process on how and when this connection between climate change and biodiversity started in a COP, right? And I think that it would be very useful if you give us this historical perspective, in a sense, on when exactly biodiversity started being a topic in a COP.
Great. Thank you very much. Alicia? Yeah. Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful panel today and for bringing us here this morning. In the first instance, let me begin by thanking the government of Spain and the Fundación Biodiversidad who are both IUCN members for organizing this important topic. Now, I've been involved in this process for quite a few years, and if you look at, we all know that the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are not two separate crises. They're integrally linked together, and you cannot solve one without solving the other. In fact, the IPBES IPCC report said very explicitly that if you cannot succeed on either of these unless they're really joined up together, and indeed you will fail. But in the world of international policy, they have often been dealt with in two separate silos. You've had the CBD process focusing on biodiversity. You've had the UNFCCC process focusing on climate change. And of course, the CBD process has an agenda item on biodiversity and climate change for several years now. And in the UNFCCC process, yes, it was there right in the beginning, even if we go back to 1992 and the Rio Convention, that recognized the importance of, conserving and protecting sinks of all types. There's Article 4.1d, including all marine, coastal, and terrestrial ecosystems. However, the notion of biodiversity being an integral part of the climate solution was not really that prominent. I think it only started coming up around prominently, I think I would date it back to COP25, the Madrid COP, where for the first time, in decision text in the cover decision, you had an explicit recognition of the contribution that nature could make in addressing the climate problem, and the notion that you needed to have integrated action on both climate and biodiversity. However, again, the notion of the two crises being interlinked actually was formally recognized only in the Glasgow COP the following year, in COP26. And what preceded it in IUCN, I think from our global membership of, 1,500 members, including 200 government organizations and states and 1,200 NGOs, We had our IUCN Congress in Marseille in 2021 as well, just before Glasgow. And the top headline that came out of that Congress was that the two crises couldn't be dealt with separately, but were an integral part of, two sides of the same coin, as you put it. And hence we push strongly for it as a wide community, all of us, CI, Spain, all of us collectively, I think there was a momentum behind it. And that notion of it being an, interlinked crisis that needed to be tackled jointly was recognized in Glasgow. And since Glasgow, it's been repeated in every climate COP since, including most recently in the global outcome, the outcome of the first global stocktake decision that was agreed in Dubai last year was very explicit about not only that recognition, but it called for actions to address, there's a strong recognition of the importance of ecosystems and nature in helping to meet the Paris Agreement's temperature goals, its adaptation goals, and indeed also, for the first time, it includes a specific target for ending and forest loss and for halting and reversing forest loss and degradation by 2030. And what's most important is that there's explicit language that says that, conservation action, biodiversity conservation can play a important role in addressing the climate problem. And therefore, everything that happens in this space must also be aligned with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So that explicit recognition also came through in this COP. So I'll just maybe leave it there to just sort of to give the arc of travel, but happy to come back more in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. I forgot to introduce you properly, actually. So Sandeep is the global policy lead in the climate change department of IUCN. My apologies. I have a follow-up question for you. So, because we were talking before starting about the rights of indigenous people and local communities, and I wanted to ask you about what's the role of all of this in this link between climate change and biodiversity?
No, thanks for that. I mean, the role of indigenous peoples and local communities is absolutely central to this. You cannot have, successful outcomes on the ground without really fully taking into account the concerns, the rights, the interests, indeed also the traditional knowledge of local communities and indigenous peoples. And I think, many in our community already know this, but, it's important to remind everyone that, indigenous peoples help manage 80% of the world's biodiversity, despite, having only 8% of the world's population. I think, studies have shown that 25% of all tropical forest carbon is managed on indigenous and local community lands. Conservation International did a study, I think, a couple of years back or so, that looked at irrecoverable carbon and found that, 33% of the irrecoverable carbon is also managed by indigenous peoples. So they play an absolutely central role in helping to operationalize the climate and biodiversity crisis, and therefore, in our view as IUCN, we absolutely call for them to be supported, for them to be recognized, including for them to receive more direct access to financing, which is a really important component of, making sure that they can continue to do what they have historically done as effective and continue to be effective stewards and custodians of the world's ecosystems for all of us as an international community.
Thank you, Sandeep. So, and it's not only about local communities and indigenous people, it's also about parties, right? About countries. And now I'm looking at you, Carissa. So Carissa Kaspersak, she is the Director of Climate Policy and Conservation International. And Carissa, I know that Nature for Climate is releasing a second edition of its guide for including nature in NDCs, in the National Determined Contributions. So my question would be like, why and how parties use this guide?
Great. Thank you so much, Alicia. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks to Spain for having us. So yes, as Alicia mentioned, the Nature for Climate Coalition, which is a group of 28 global environmental youth indigenous organizations, has recently launched its second edition of the Guide for Including Nature in NDCs. This is a complete overhaul, actually, of the first edition. It's super comprehensive, and it's really meant as a practical tool for policymakers when looking at their NDC for the 2025 NDC cycle, and to recognizing that all countries have different entry points into NDCs, recognizing that most countries actually include nature in their 2020 NDCs. It's already in there, but there's a lot of different ways that countries can increase the ambition, increase the implementability, increase climate biodiversity linkages within their NDCs. And so this guide, we have 15 guiding points along the NDC enhancement cycle: preparation, target setting, thinking through implementation and finance. And so, really kind of trying to guide them through and meeting countries kind of where they're at, saying, okay, if this is an interest to you, these are recommendations and tools that you can use within this part of your NDC. So, just to highlight a few of the specific points around the climate biodiversity linkages there. So thinking through thinking about preparation, right? Because there's a lot of preparation that goes into actually, setting targets and thinking through what an NDC is. And so, recommendations there are around whole of society and whole of government approaches, right? Making sure that different ministries that cover climate and biodiversity are talking to each other and really on the same page, that they're aligned. That the people who are writing the NDCs are talking with the people who are writing the NBSAPs, those types of things. And then whole of society as well, as Sandeep was mentioning, with indigenous peoples, local communities, making sure that we're hearing their voices, that the process is inclusive, that they, and generating buy-in, right? At the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be implementing a lot of these actions on the ground. And then there's a good amount of data collection as well that goes into, NDCs. And so, and for climate and biodiversity in nature, a lot of it ideally would be, using spatial data, spatially mapping where are biodiversity hotspots, where are the irrecoverable carbon systems that, that have a lot of high biodiversity and that really provide win-wins for climate and biodiversity. And so mapping those out and prioritizing those within target setting. And then finally also mapping out, most countries are in the process of setting NBSAP targets and developing the full NBSAPs. And again, mapping out, okay, how aligned are they right now? And what are the opportunities, challenges to aligning them and making sure that becomes a lens throughout the NDC development process as well. So then that's kind of thinking about all of the readiness steps. And then when actually thinking about target setting, making sure that all of the targets are covering all of the relevant ecosystems within a country. Right now we see a lot of targets around forests, but less around things like wetlands, peatlands. Even the agriculture sector is not as well reflected in 2020 NDCs as it could be, right? So making sure that to increase coverage of ecosystems and land sector, making sure that the adaptation, any adaptation components are taking into account the decision last year and the targets around ecosystems and biodiversity, the targets around cultural heritage and indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge. And then we actually have a section as well on loss and damage. This is not something that we're seeing in a lot of NDCs, or we've seen in NDCs, but there are lots of different ways that countries can start to include a loss and damage lens in their NDC as well. And thinking through for biodiversity, right, where are climate impacts on biodiversity going to be felt? What are the actions that they can take now to reduce the impact, or to think about things like migration of species and those types of things in people as well, and making sure to reduce kind of the knock-on effects of those issues. And then finally, we also talk about the nature in non-land sector things, renewable energy, making sure that renewable energy is cited in a way that's not negatively affecting biodiversity, and those types of things as well. So, lots of linkages there when actually thinking about setting the targets themselves. And then finally, the big piece, we're at the Finance COP thinking about how NDCs can be more implementable and more easier to finance, right? And actions basically that countries can take in the NDCs themselves to help set themselves up for success. Making sure that it's written within the NDC or in some kind of accompanying roadmap around aligning climate and biodiversity policies, around institutionalizing frameworks, mainstreaming climate biodiversity within government and societal institutions. And then also aligning, finance flows. Maybe we'll see something in the finance goal this time, but there's already something in the global biodiversity framework about scaling down incentives that are harmful for biodiversity, thinking through how to incorporate that in the NDC in policies and measures and implementation as well to make sure that the finance starts flowing in the right direction.
Thank you, Carissa. I really like the fact that you said that not all ecosystems are considered equally. I'm an ocean person, and I really think that we don't think about ocean enough. So, but I have a follow-up question that is more like a curiosity, actually. It's like, do you have any knowledge of if parties are really using this guide? Because it seems very relevant, because it's quite complete.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is something that's actually been in development for a while, and across the N4C institutions that have been writing it, we've already been supporting countries on their NDC development as countries have already started it this year. And we, in Bonn, actually earlier this year, we did a consultation on kind of the first draft of the guidance to get government inputs on, is this useful? So we did some revisions done over the last few months to really take their comments into account and try to really make it something that's super practical and has a lot of resources. And I think that it's something that can be evergreen, for 2025 NDCs, 2030 NDCs. We really tried to make it not only applicable for this moment, but thinking about NDCs in general. I think that most countries are trying to meet the February 2025 deadline. I think so. This guide is coming in right at the right moment for countries who are kind of really getting into this process now. But I do think that we'll see NDCs kind of trickling in next year, and so hopefully this will continue to be a resource throughout next year before COP30, and then countries are invited to update their NDCs at any point in time as well. And so this will continue to be a resource for countries for thinking about, implementation planning, all of those different types of things. The resources are NDC relevant, right? But they're not only relevant for NDCs. And so I think that hopefully we'll see uptake through the N4C coalition and through other governments and different regional coalitions over the next few months in particular, but then over the next couple of years to come.
Thank you, Carissa. Really interesting. And everybody knows that to be able to accomplish all of these things and to implement all these great ideas, we need money. So, and let me introduce you to Alicia Montalvo. Alicia is the manager of climate action and positive biodiversity at CAF, and how we say it in Spanish, my tocaya, which is that we share the same name. So, Alicia, we know that you were at COP16, now you're here, so you are a person that really understands the core of this issue, and you know that the importance of conserving and restoring ecosystems is a shared responsibility. So how a development bank like CAF is contributing to it?
Thank you very much, Tocaya. And I think that this is a very relevant discussion, and I have been in the negotiations for many years, and always the biodiversity has been like the wake element of this environmental discussions, and this is very sad. Now I am working in a Latin American and Caribbean institution, and really we see that it's impossible to talk about climate change without talking about biodiversity, for many reasons. Many of them have been already stressed, but when you talk with the people, which is really our aim, to improve the quality of lives of people, they really don't care if the problems they have come from climate change or from the loss of biodiversity, because they both are related. I will make an example. When the wetlands are destroyed, there is a problem for the impacts of climate change, or in the mangroves, of course, it's the same. And so I think that this is artificial distinction between climate change and biodiversity has not been very good for solving the problem, because first, and you talk about financial resources, is because we need to finance with an integrated view. We need to make, we need to solve the problems, and in many cases, the problems of climate change come from the destruction of the biodiversity, and so that they are very much related, and you need to have an overall approach. So what are we doing now is, first in the institution in CAF, I am responsible for both things, and we have developed the so-called ecosystem approach, which is something in the Biodiversity Convention, and we try to really have this look towards the ecosystem, first as an integrated approach, focusing on the people and also having in mind the transnational relation. There are no boundaries for the ecosystems, and the problems of climate change come from go to these ecosystems without understanding where is the limit. So what we need to do is to really work to develop instruments that promote this relation. First, when we talk about nature-based solutions, which used to be the only way that biodiversity was in the Climate Change Convention, in the climate change discussions, it's like this strange expression at the beginning was nature-based solutions. What is this? And this was the only way to introduce deforestation in the climate change negotiation. Now, nature-based solutions is everything. So from the financial point of view, what we are doing now is all our instruments tackle both things at the same time. We have loans that introduce one subsidy when it is linked to results related to biodiversity and climate change. We look at the problems from a general point of view. For instance, I will make some reference to the also even the green bonds. The green bonds that we are working very much are linked to actions in mitigation, in adaptation, and in ecosystemic approach. Even I would say that the distinction between mitigation and adaptation is also very artificial. So all these compartments we have created, I think now there are problems, because even for the financial discussions, they say, no, we need money for this, we need money for that, and everything is the same. At last, you need to solve the problem of the people by protecting their ways of living, the fisheries, the wetlands. So how can we do is, I think, to really rethink the instruments we are using for climate change and biodiversity, and work in an integrated manner. We are doing that. But it's not easy sometimes, because all these guides, analyses are still very much focused on climate change and biodiversity. So we are working with this ecosystem approach that tries to mix both things, even including the ocean, as you well know, the blue economy. So trying to focus on what are people's problems. What is your problem? We need to solve that. And then, of course, you look at the mitigation, adaptation, but not as a separate problem. So this is our approach now.
Thank you, Alicia. I really like it. I know that you really understand the topic, because we had conversations about it, and you have the most beautiful pavilion in COP16 was CAF's pavilion. Just let me tell you this. And you've been talking about this connection with people, right? Because on top of that, you work in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a hot spot for biodiversity. But I want to go a little bit farther away and see if you can explain to us, like, how CAF is also not only helping people connect these two topics, but also at the level of the Paris Agreement and the goals of the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework.
Well, this is part of the question. We request plans and measures for this Paris Agreement on Global Biodiversity Framework fulfillment. And at last, in the Paris Agreement, we find that resilience is one of the main issues we need to take into account when we analyze our operations. We always focus too much on mitigation, and I think that adaptation is very much related to biodiversity. So if you include nature-based solutions in your resilient plans, you are protecting biodiversity. So we see that we see the need for working together both instruments and changing the approach. That's why, well, we have developed now one taxonomy for the biodiversity. I know that the multilateral development banks are doing that, but we are not part of this big banks group. But we are also working in a taxonomy that really integrates both things in the biodiversity and climate in the taxonomy. And at last, when you look at the projects, you try to take all these considerations into account, both of them, Paris Agreement and GBF. But I think that this distinction, at last, is not relevant. The relevant thing is how to solve the problems using as much as possible the natural solutions, the protecting nature. I think that we should perhaps rethink how these discussions began in 1992 and maybe go before. So that's.
Yeah, and I agree completely with you that like a couple of years ago, biodiversity people, we were really pushing for these nature-based solutions, but now we really need to push for adaptation to be at the same level of mitigation and to break these silos and create more synergies and connections. And with this, I'm going to talk with Elena Pita, which is the director of the Biodiversity Foundation. And by the way, Biodiversity Foundation, thank you for inviting all of us here. And Elena, I'm going to focus on the private sector because I think that you and the Biodiversity Foundation, you talk to a lot of people, you engage with a very wide variety of stakeholders, and the private sector is one of them. And sometimes in these conversations, I think that the private sector is missing or is not well present, and it's an actor. We really need to invite them to the table, and this is what you're doing at the foundation. So you're promoting nature as a source of solution and with them as well. So what are the initiatives of the foundation with the private sector?
Thank you, Alicia. Well, I think we all agree, and both COPs recognize the need of mobilized funding from the private sector in order to achieve these trillions that are being discussed somewhere not far from here. So from the private sector side, it is important to understand what this integration means. We want the private sector to integrate climate change and biodiversity concerns in the decisions they make day by day. And to do that, they need to understand what are the impacts, but also the dependencies on natural resources of the business models, and also the risks and opportunities. I think the risks aspect has been very important, and now many businesses are starting to understand that many opportunities will arise from an ecological transition. But it's not only the private sector side, it's also the rest of the society side, because for that to be successful, we need a strong governance in all the dimensions. We need, on the one hand, we need regulations, we need institutions, we need participations, and this is very much linked to the aspect you mentioned of local communities and indigenous people. And also, we need leadership, which is also an important aspect that we here in the negotiations can really feel what it means. This strong leadership. So, of course, it's a complex issue because environmental matters are complex. And in order to try to contribute a little bit to this, we have developed a business and biodiversity initiative where we try to connect the administration with the private sector for environmental in different environmental aspects. We have we have a community of practice because we want to strengthen this dialogue between the administration or the regulation side with the private sector. And we work in three main lines of work. Negotiation is one of them, because many companies are interested in understanding what is being negotiated at the global level. Many of them are are more aware of the climate change negotiations than the biodiversity negotiations. But this year it was, I think, successful in terms of the participation of companies in COP16. We also work a lot in metrics and methodologies, because I think at the local level, these COP-to-COP synergies are very evident. You see it, well, in forestry or in agriculture, etc. But when it comes to the local level, and when we have to deliver on our commitments, we need to measure, we need indicators, and we need transparency. So this is a huge area that is being developed, but we need to work with these companies in order to make it as easier as possible. It will always be complex, but as easier as possible. And this is also linked to what you mentioned of NDCs and BSAPs, etc. How we link that. And the third line of work is well, we develop annual plans of work, and we work in regulations. So this year we've been working a lot in the EUDR, the deforestation regulation, which is a matter of concern for many enterprises. So this is how we work with we also work with the private sector in grants. So we have a line of work for circular economy, which is also another huge area of work. But I think it is interesting to have these two sides, this policy reflection and this connection and this dialogue between private and public sector. And then, of course, funding is always required. And for us, it's been very interesting also to work with this circular economy line of work, where we have delivered 400 million euros in order to promote circular economy in Spain. So.
Thank you, Elena. And I know that this might be an obvious question, and you kind of answered a little bit, but can you give us a little bit more on why? Why do we need the private sector here? Why is this important?
Well, I think what we are really discussing here is an important transformation of the model of production and consumption, and this is why climate change and nature are interlinked, because. Of course, climate change is an important driver of biodiversity loss. And of course, nature and biodiversity are an important source of solutions. But the problem behind both drivers is that we have an unsustainable model of production and consumption. And so I think it is important that as the society as a whole understands that many things need to be changed. And this is a profound change in society, and it has to be done by all stakeholders at the same time. So we need private sector to produce in a more circular and more efficient, a more carbon neutral manner, but we also need that from the side of social civil society, well, to understand that the world is changing and our relation to what we wear, what we eat, what we buy need to change too. And this is a change for the better. I think we need to have also this hope that that this transformation is to make a better world, not a worse one.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more. And for that, we also need science. So, and here is our last speaker, Frederick Bond, who is a scientist of ecosystem modeling at the, and let's see if I say it correctly, Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. I call them UFZ. That's why, I think that is the first time that I say the complete name out loud. So.
But it was good.
Thank you. Yay.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and the honor to have to be part of this panel. I think one important thing is, if you think about biodiversity and climate, you have to. Or when you look at climate, you mainly look at CO2 and hopefully more and more about methane, which are two components of the whole carbon cycle. And if you look at the whole carbon cycle, you see that the carbon which is stored in the atmosphere is equal to the carbon which is stored in the vegetation. And if you look also in the, or include also the soils and organic carbon, also in the ocean, you have 5 to 6 times the carbon compared to the carbon which is in the atmosphere. And I think this is one big argument to link these two concepts of biodiversity and climate very, very strongly. But adding all this biodiversity research into the climate research makes things much more complex. And some people think, oh my God, it's complex now, but as I'm an ecosystem analyst, I like it when it's complex. And so what I do in my work is to model forests all over the world. And we are interested in the linkage between climate change, biodiversity, but also structural diversity. And we try also to link it to remote sensing, because this is a new tool which helps us to measure also biodiversity or these aspects all over the world. And what we use is a model which allows us to simulate every single tree in a forest. And we could simulate really large areas. And sometimes we simulate only small areas which are relevant for foresters, but we could simulate all trees in whole countries. Even the whole Amazon we were able to simulate. And the thing is that we really can estimate the carbon balance of every single tree. And every single tree, of course, has a certain species. And what I interesting in my research is to better understand the different dimension of biodiversity. So we were now talking on biodiversity in general, but I think if we talk about biodiversity, we have to keep in mind 3 important things. So the first is, due to the future, or when we look at the past, we have a relatively stable climate, and we normally have only one thing we want to gain from an ecosystem. For example, if you look at a forest, stable climate, and we want to have timber, it's clear which is in a certain climate the best species. So we go for one species in our forest. But now there's a lot of change. I mean, there's a change of climate. So we will have more droughts, we will have more floods. So it makes it all more complex. And on the other hand, we are more and more aware of the different services ecosystems deliver to us. So it's not only about timber, it's also about the water cycle, it's also about food or whatever. Erosion protection. And so if we have different targets for an ecosystem, we need different players in the system. And I mean, so this means that we have to include in our system different actors, so different species. And on top of that, it means like having a football team, right? So to solve the problem, you need a football team. And but what I want to mention is not only it's important to just count species, it's also important to look at the functions they have in the system. So some species, for example, need a shadow area, the other one needs a lot of light, more water, less water, etc. So you need a complete team. We are here in a Spain pavilion, so if you think of a football team, of course you need a goalkeeper and you need the person who is in front and shoot the goals. And I think there's a third aspect which is very important. It's important where the species are located in the whole system. So it's a kind of what is the strategy of the system? And when you look at the football team again, so you won the European Championship because you have a good team. So you have a team. They have different functions, and they are all at the right position on the field. And it's the same for ecosystems. So we need the different functions of the species placed at the right place to solve the climate crisis and other crises as well, by the way.
I really like it because, I love functional ecology, and we really defend from my institution. I come from a research center. I'm also a scientist, a research center in Spain, CREAF, and we work on ecology of climate change and biodiversity. And we always say that for conservation purposes, you need to think about functions. And it's not only about preserving the panda or the whale, it's about preserving the function that the panda, the whale, or the little beetle is doing in that ecosystem, and that's why you need to preserve them. And then if they are beautiful, that's a plus. But it's very important to think from that functional perspective that you were mentioning. And in that sense, I wanted to ask you a little bit, if you can go more into how including the social and the economic perspectives can make us to have this integrated approach to increase the resilience of the ecosystem services.
So if you have different species, so they can jump into the different problems. So one species is perfect adapted to drought. The other one is more affected to wetter conditions or whatever. And if, looking from an economic perspective, we want to have a stable production, or, for example, if you want to look at timber, we want that the forest produces timber to a stable situation or in a stable rate. And to make this sure, we need the different players, so the different species, which deliver under the different circumstances a certain amount of services. And therefore, it's very important, so even from an economic perspective, to have high biodiversity in the system, because this helps us to plan and to look into the future for the production. And I just want to underline the point that one very important argument is the beauty of biodiversity. I always have the feeling that it's falling down, but I think, hey, come on, we just want to live on a beautiful planet, and I think that's important.
Yep, absolutely. So so thank you very much to all of you. This was a dream panel, I have to say, because we have so many different perspectives that makes the whole thing very rich. And I'm also a very positive person. And I really want to, sometimes COPs can be very depressing. I don't know about you, but I cry a lot in COPs because, sometimes you hear things that you don't want to hear, or reality is too harsh. And I don't want to end with that note. We are almost at the end of COP29, and I don't want to go into what is going on in the plenaries, but I want to ask you a message for hope. What is your desire for COP29, and what will be your desire message for COP30? Because once we're done here, we need to start preparing the next one. So if you can give us this desire of what do you want the world to be like? Taking into consideration that we are connecting climate change and biodiversity, and to make it easier, maybe we can start with Frederick and go back because you have the mic.
Okay, so I think, as the panel already realized, that there's more and more progress, including nature-based solution and biodiversity into the COP process here. But I think there's still a long way to go, but the step is okay for now. And I think if we go further on this path, we will be able to solve not only the climate crisis, but many other crises as well. And I think this is the essential. So biodiversity is the bridge between the different crises, and we are more and more aware of it, and that's the good thing.
Yeah, well, we as the Biodiversity Foundation, we are related, or we are attached to the Ministry of Ecological Transition, but we are not part of the negotiations. Our role here is to coordinate the activities of the Spain Pavilion, all these discussions, etc. And but before I worked with the ministry, and I was involved in the negotiations a long time ago. And my experience in having been in both sides is that negotiators are discussing about what needs to be done and what we are not doing, and what needs to be better. And here in the pavilions, at least, we are discussing what is really being done and what actions are being taken. So I think we are more optimistic in this side of the of the COP, because it is true that ambition is the key word, and we need ambition, and urgency is the second key word, and we need to do it fast. But it is true that there is room for hope, because many things are being done and there's people doing things. So let's keep the pace and scale it up.
Great. How can I follow on that? No, that I agree with everything that that both Frederick and Elena have said. In a sense, what really needs to happen here is the unlocking of finance, which we hope, there is some progress on. Equally, you mentioned 10th February next year is when countries are required to submit their new NDCs of higher ambition. So we hope that they will take the signal that was sent from the global stocktake last year to put forward, stronger NDCs, very much along the lines of what Carissa explained. But then looking forward from and I fully agree, I think there's climate change and biodiversity loss are not state-level problems, they're society-level problems. So, the solutions also have to come from across every part of society and across every part of the economy. And there's good things happening in those spaces. And the more we can support those, I think we will be better off. And it would only make it better if the international process also then sends the right signals in support of those. So to your second question on looking ahead to, COP30, I mean, we are going to the heart of the Amazon next year in Belém, and in a sense, from our side, we are really, hoping and we're calling upon, Brazil in a sense to really make nature and climate a central focus of the Belém COP. And, it would be maybe, I mean, these things are, easier said than done, but if COP30 could send across, a practical signal on how to bring the climate and the biodiversity agendas together, including potentially through, people are talking about, the possibilities of joint work programs, that would be fantastic, in terms of helping to bridge these two, separate processes that we know do need to be bridged in reality. But maybe I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Really, it's really great to hear everyone's thoughts, and I'll try to kind of bring some together here in terms of thinking about the future. So I think that thinking about this COP, I actually do spend most of my time actually on that side and thinking about the negotiations. I actually do find the negotiations hopeful sometimes because it's about, on this side, we're like, well, we're already doing this stuff and we know what works and why don't the governments get it yet, right? But thinking about it from the multilateral process, this is actually about getting everyone to agree, right? That we know that this is the direction that we need to head in. And so it does take a little bit longer, and it can be frustrating when we know, what works and we know the solutions that are needed. And so I think that, for this COP, if, I am hopeful that there will be a positive signal coming out about finance at this COP, about the need for trillions, about the need to increased access for indigenous peoples, about the need to scale down climate finance flows that are counter to climate objectives. There is some language in there about climate, biodiversity, land degradation, sustainable development linkages for finance, which is really positive to see. And so I think that we can get it's just the beginning, really, but it's about this idea of, okay, let's really start the mobilization of the trillions. Let's work on the public finance, and hopefully the private finance will get in there as well. Innovative sources, all of these different types of things to really get that finance piece right. That can be a huge signal and really get things moving and signal to countries as well for these NDCs that, okay, you can be ambitious because there will be finance, and that's super important. The one thing that I would like to see going towards COP30, building upon this finance momentum, is additional focus on ways to close the nature finance gap. Right? It is actually the most disproportionate gap that we're seeing in terms of where money's going towards where the finance flows are kind of against the objectives, and so how to close that gap. And so I do think that the focus in Brazil on the Amazon, we can take the I'll call it the more general finance outcomes here, and really think about specific nature finance outcomes at COP30.
To me, the negotiations for many years have had a very global north approach. In fact, all the negotiations mostly began with the problem of climate change and the approach that the European Union, especially the European Union, had on the need to reduce greenhouse emissions. For me, it's important that we shift this view and we focus on the global south view. Working now in a Latin American and Caribbean institution, I see that sometimes the voice of these regions are not present enough in the negotiations. That's why now we begin to talk much more about adaptation and biodiversity, because there is this shift. And so for us, the success would be what we call from Cali to Belém. This is the two Latin American countries leading these discussions, biodiversity and climate change next year. And we see that for instance, the Amazon you have mentioned, there are more people living in towns, in cities, in Amazon cities than in the forest. And we need to focus on that. Sometimes we think that the Amazon is only the big forest, which is really true. But the problem is that 50 million people live there in cities. So we need to focus on solving the problems of them, because probably part of the deforestation come because they don't have the quality of life they need. So I think that the shift in the way we look at the negotiations for us could be a success, to have this Latin American and Caribbean view and lens in the negotiations. And we think this will happen.
So thank you all. We have a couple of minutes, 5 minutes for some questions. But before going to the questions, I want to thank the speakers, because that was a surprise question. I didn't warn them that I was going to do a teeny tiny surprise at the end, because I think that improvisation sometimes really works. So my apologies. And now, I don't know if our audience has questions for our amazing speakers. No? Elena?
It works, yeah. Yeah, I think, thank you very much. I think it's really interesting. I think one of the things, thinking also of COP30, I wanted to bring on to the table the global goal on adaptation, which is being discussed at the moment. And, we heard a lot about the NDCs, but I wanted kind of, in the panel, to comment, because we are discussing, as we speak, indicators on the global goal on adaptation. And of course, some of them will be on biodiversity and ecosystems. So what are your thoughts about also how this could be reflected into the national adaptation plans? Because I agree that we bring in this and it's giving them a strong voice because they are at the forefront of the impacts. So just a few thoughts on how that biodiversity could be critical also in the global goal on adaptation.
Okay, I'm happy to start on that. I'm sure others have things to add. So I think, as you mentioned, Alethea, sorry, nature-based solutions, ecosystems are something that it's not as if they give mitigation benefits in one box and adaptation benefits in another box. The beauty of them is that they give these benefits exactly at the same time. And therefore, the value of ecosystems shouldn't be reduced to their carbon function alone. It should be a wider, and hence I think the contribution towards a global goal on adaptation is a very important one. And it also feeds into the notion that the climate, this imbalance that exists between mitigation and adaptation in the framing, in the financing, all of this needs to be corrected, in the sense, and partly because there is less ambition on mitigation, it makes the need for addressing, increasing ambition on adaptation and unfortunately on loss and damage even more important. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that under the global goal on adaptation, last year the UAE framework for global climate resilience agreed on these targets for 2030, right? One of which explicitly, I think if I remember correctly, 9D, focuses on reducing the impacts of climate change on nature and encourages the acceleration of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation. And now the UAE BELEM work program is put in place precisely to develop targets and indicators for each of these. So I think that's a useful place for us to really focus on as a community. And certainly I agree fully, as you said, when we are talking of incorporating nature in NDCs, from our point of view, it's just as important to make sure that nature is included in the NAPs and as well. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And just to complement here a little bit, so when thinking about the guide and what I presented, there is very specifics in there around, adaptation targets within NDCs, but then the link, we do try to give that guidance around linkages between NDCs and NAPs, and the NBSAPs as well, as I had mentioned. For the GGA indicators process, I think it's actually a very exciting for the Paris Agreement because NDCs don't have indicators, right? So this is actually going to be one of the very first times that all countries will kind of have indicators that they should be looking at around adaptation. And Elena mentioned, right, with the private sector looking at indicators, it can be a complex process. I think right now they started with a list of like 5,000 to 7,000 indicators that they're looking at. It's crazy, right? And the process that they'll have over the next year is really narrowing that down to a manageable set of indicators. But it's exciting because, you know, as we know, like what gets measured gets managed. And so if we can really get indicators within that process that are holistic, that really encourage countries to look at climate and biodiversity around adaptation, that look at climate and biodiversity and traditional knowledge and cultural heritage and really thinking about the targets holistically, then it can really push countries to think in ways that maybe they wouldn't have before, because they're thinking about these indicators and things that are very specific that they should be thinking about within their adaptation planning, and so I think that it's an exciting opportunity, and will be definitely a way that at COP30 that there can be leadership and progress around climate, biodiversity, and adaptation planning.
Elena, do you want to say something?
Very briefly, that I think today is Biodiversity Day, and the Declaration on Water for Adaptation Action will be launched, or is being launched right now. So I think this is also a good entry point for these COP-to-COP synergies, and it's very related to adaptation, of course. And I think of Valencia and what happened with the Dana that we all regret very much. So I think it's a very important point.
So thank you all very, very much. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your messages of hope. I didn't give mine, but I don't think that I have time. So I think that my only message for hope is to continue building these synergies among all of the actors, and including all society and all levels of government. And thank you for the audience here and also in streaming. And have a nice day today. Have a nice biodiversity day.